Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm Bridget Burns, the Executive Director of the University Innovation Alliance.
And I'm Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, I partner with a journalist to have a conversation with a sitting college president or chancellor to try and distill how we can lead in these moments that are so challenging, get some inspiration, some hope, and hopefully some insight that will motivate you for the rest of the week. So that's the inspiration behind Start the Week with Wisdom, and it also goes by Weekly Wisdom.
And this week, we're really lucky and delighted to bring you a discussion with Chris Howard, who's the president of Robert Morris University in Pennsylvania. President Howard was previously the president at Hampton-Sydney College. And beyond his higher education leadership experience, he has a really unusual background as a former Air Force helicopter pilot, intelligence officer, an NCAA academic All-American in football, and a Rhodes Scholar. Dr. Howard, thanks for being here and welcome. Wanted to get a sense as we start off all these interviews by trying to get a sense of how you're doing, how you're holding up personally and professionally.
Well, I like to say that if you think you're doing great, then you're either crazy or Jeff Bezos. Those folks are fine because they're not in reality not to be politically incorrect, they're not in reality or they're gazillionaires. Everybody else, we're okay, and I'm okay as an institution. We're doing fine, but hey, let's admit it. It is day to day, minute to minute. We're living in a pandemic, and we're doing the best we can. Our students and faculty and staff are hanging in there, and morale is pretty good. But I would tell you, this is not easy.
I completely understand. And we're so grateful to have you here because you have been, I think the first time I met you, you were giving a speech about leadership and you were helping people understand what it's like to lead. I think you were referencing your military experience prior, but you also in football and other things, you really understand leadership. So we're looking for some leadership today. It's a very anxious time in this country. It's a very anxious time in higher ed. And I would love if you could speak to our audience and show us how you are kind of settling the ball with your team and with folks on your campus and just in this moment. Can you show us how one could lead in this moment?
Thank you, Bridget. It is a precarious time. And what I've done in my communication with my community, and it is a community, right? It's faculty, staff, students, parents, town and gown, local political leaders, etc. And one of the things I do is I say, let's start off and just call out the moment. Let's be honest or vulnerable, whichever word you want to use, and say that we're in a pandemic inside of a pandemic inside of a pandemic. So we have the global health pandemic. We have a social justice or injustice, a racial inequity pandemic, and then we have a pandemic of the republic, which is what kind of republic or democracy are we going to have beyond tomorrow, which is critically important. So I start my talks off by simply saying, this is where we are. Take a deep breath. Then I say, let's recognize what we can do as an institution and institutions and as individuals to impact and affect change. Because if you call out the moment and then you are overwhelmed by it, that's not good. And if you call out the moment and you're just doing incremental tiny things, that's not good either, because we can do more as an institution of Robert Morris University and higher education than just as Chris or Bridget or as Doug. And then in terms of the next step, and this is what I learned as a military officer, and this is what I learned as a business leader, and this is what I learned as a football player, is that you got to execute. You have to have a plan. You have to do your best to execute that plan. What you say and what you do, you try to do your best to make those one-to-one. People will forgive you if you don't execute the plan, even when the stakes are high, but the plan better be well done, well thought out. It better have community buy-in, expertise, science matters, etc. And then you got to try your best to execute that and then communicate how you're doing against that. I'll stop here and say that we created a reopening plan. We were one of the first schools in Pennsylvania to create a reopening plan called Reopening RMU. And we got great praise from our colleagues and from the Department of Education because we were brave enough to put it out there and brave enough to change it and over time. And so that's where we are now. And I think that, I'm not the exemplar of leadership, but I'm trying my best. And as you said before, Bridget and Doug, my past experiences have helped serve this.
I'm interested in how you balance sort of short-term and long-term thinking in a moment like this. There's I get the sense that a lot of institutional leaders, and it's understandable, head down, focused on right now, and yet, given the larger moment in higher education where there's institutional strain, financial demographic, et cetera, institutions also have to be thinking how they come out, assuming they come out in it, which I think most will, what they come out positioned for. And I'm curious how you balance those two, and they're obviously not diametrically opposed, but how you balance those two things.
Yeah, as a leader, we do have to see kind of the deep battle and the close battle. I'll do one military example that has gotten to popular leadership culture and writing. So in the military, we're taught that you have a battle in classic sort of Napoleonic parlance. You have a near battle, an intermediate battle, and tomorrow's battle, and you're simultaneously, as a leader, moving up and down those. What's happening at the front line of our troops? What's happening at the forward edge of the battlefield, and what's happening in the deep battle? That's just kind of how we're trained. So I'm not special. I'm just communicating that as an analogy. Now, in terms of mindset, which is critically important, Doug, to answer your question, Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. A lot of it's about mindset and culture, right? And so what we decided about 2 years ago, and to your point, that things were tough before COVID hit because there's overcapacity in higher education, there are demographic challenges, there are challenges with inequity, et cetera. And I think the University Innovation Alliance has done a great job of addressing those things. They exist. But we decided as a senior leadership team that we're going to adopt the Stockdale paradox. If you remember from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, Admiral Stockdale was a guy who ran for vice president with Ross Perot. Right. Not his greatest moment, but when he was a prisoner of war, he said that when you were, why, did you ever think you'd be comparing running a university to being a prisoner of war? It's 2020 when you do that. But stay with me on this, Doug and Bridget, because it makes sense. We said what Stockdale said was the folks that were going to be able to make it through the difficult times with no clear end game in mind. We know it's going to get better. We don't know when. They would say, okay, he said, the ones that said, I'm going to make it to Christmas, and then when Christmas hits, I'm going to be home. Well, they got the Christmas, and they didn't go home. They weren't, repatriated. They simply perished. They literally would pass away. And those that said that, well, there's no hope, they also would never make it. You got to calibrate that. And so what we've done as a leadership team, along with the board, is talk about it all the time. What does it mean to be gritty? What does it mean to kind of be in the messiness? When we had our first, so for 7 months almost, I started meeting with my cabinet +5 every day, including weekends for the first 2 weeks. And then we've kind of tapered off to two meetings a week, specifically on COVID items. And I said in the beginning, I said, ladies and gentlemen, don't think about this in terms of days. Think about it in terms of months. Prepare yourself to act like this at least through January. Unfortunately, I was a prophet. I wish I weren't. I wish I wasn't that good in terms of predicting the future. So I go, you have to take care of your mind, your body, and your soul. Otherwise, you can't help other people take care of their mind, bodies, and soul. So that mindset, the growth mindset's one thing, but this Stockdale paradox takes us a long way because it's a gritty, difficult, 4 quarters and 3 overtimes or 4 overtimes.
I want to follow up on that I keep seeing a lot of folks making reference to they're hearing from their senior leaders, take care of yourself. And then 5 minutes later, they're handing them a new assignment, more work, right? Knowing just how exhausted we all are on Zoom and disconnected. And I feel like loneliness is just a new thing that we're needing to grapple with and how it's showing up and affecting us professionally. And it doesn't seem like there's a real solution for it because we keep getting invited to virtual conferences where you're just in an audience and you don't get actually any connection. I'm just wondering if you have any tactical suggestions for people that you're giving of how exactly do you take care of yourself in this moment? Because it seems like higher ed doesn't have a lot of credibility when it comes to talking about self-care.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, that's also what we're trying to get our students to do, right, Bridget? I mean, we're working hard using tech to lead to touch, right? So in some ways, in terms of mental health on the student side, we're getting as good of people attending and using those resources that we had before the pandemic. We have very few people that sign up that don't make it. Now they're doing it virtually, not in person, but we use all those telltale signs of technology to to send the cavalry if a student's doing poorly. On the faculty and staff side, we are relying on our human resources department. We have a great head of HR, a very talented, we partner with UPMC on healthcare. That's a big healthcare concern here. And we have a very good counseling center, and all of those resources are made available all the time. But to your point, Zoom is not the human interaction. It is not, as Aristotle said, we are political and social animals. Men and women are social and political animals. And so maybe we had a little bit too much politics. I'm in a swing state, so I've had enough politics, no more commercial. But having said that, it is kind of an individual thing as well. And sometimes by talking about it, we were doing the cocktail party on Fridays, and in the very end, I'd say, hey, tell me what you're thankful for, what you're grateful for, what have you. That was useful. We did an anti-racism task force. We have a big anti-racism task force, and we did 9 hours of training via Zoom with this organization, which uses yoga and anti-racism training. It was very powerful. And what I discovered was that a lot of us hadn't spoken, so it was just nice for us to be together, even in the big Zoom. And what the instructor did, she asked us many times, sort of, what do you do to find your joy? And it was neat is that to hear my colleagues, faculty and staff members and administrators talk about, in a student, I think here or there, talk about how they find their joy. Is it gardening? Is it yoga? Is it reading a book? Is it being with their kids? And that was so self-affirming that, it felt like you took a spring shower and did a downward dog for those of you all that do yoga all in the same moment. And it's important just to keep doing that, because here's the deal. You got to keep finding it, because you don't know when this is going to end. We hope we know when it's going to end. Back to the Stockdale paradox. One specific example, I served downrange in Afghanistan, and it was for about 6 or 7 months running human intelligence operations for covert forces. Overt forces, not covert. And I knew kind of when I was going to leave, but we didn't know when Al-Qaeda was going to leave, when the Taliban was going to leave. And look, they're still there. So it's just this mindset, this sort of grittiness. And I would say this, one last thing I would say as well, and I say this to our students all the time, is that you're tougher than you think. You're tougher than you think. I mean, your ancestors went through the Great Depression, World War I, World War II. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a chairman of a board of a foundation I started that brings kids over from South Africa called Impacting Lives. I started it, and then he's the board chair. And he says he has a 100-year-old mother-in-law that was born after the pandemic, the great influenza, Spanish flu in 1921 or whatever, and she has lived through 2 world wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, 9/11, Great Depression, and all those things, and she's still kicking. And so we have tech now. Think about it. We here we are in a pandemic, and I see Bridget. I see you more now, Bridget, than I did when we weren't in a pandemic. And so, we got to look on the bright side. We also got to realize that there's a tough and a grittiness to us as human beings, especially as Americans. I use that term operatively. I use it intentionally. We're tough folk. We will get through this, but we got to recognize that we don't know when it's going to be over, and that's okay. That's okay.
That's great. Yeah. And what you said just reminded me of some of the stuff I've heard Brene Brown talk about, and that one of the things people need to be focusing on it seems a little bit more soft and woo-woo, but in order to address what we're dealing with, it's laughter, song, dance, play. And Dr. Stuart Brown said the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. And that people have to find ways, and play is defined by something you do that you enjoy, that you lose track of time. And so just encouraging people to try and figure out what that means for them. But otherwise, I think you've given us some good food for thought in terms of tactical advice. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
What's your thought on what's likely to have kind of lasting impact from this moment, or as you described it, moments we're in? I have some hope that the sort of awareness that a lot of faculty members have, the sort of glimpse into their students' lives that they got last spring, that's one of the sort of things and the sort of view of students as human beings that you might not have when somebody's just coming in the door at the start of a class and leaving at the end of one, and also the interaction among faculty members and among faculty and staff members in terms of that lift that institutions had to do last spring in terms of moving an entire instructional operation. I'm hoping that sort of increased collaboration has some lasting impact. What are the things that you have seen in the last 6-7 months that you think are positive, again, that might have lasting impact for your institution, for your employees?
Yeah, I said before, Doug, that men and women are social animals, and there's a quote, and I think it's John F. Kennedy, but it might not be. But if it's not, please don't sue me. But it's something along the lines of, we're all in this little bitty boat on this great big sea all together. So just think about it from a humanity standpoint, a humane standpoint. If somebody gets sick, everybody's impacted and affected, and hopefully not infected. And so, we've had cases, but not contagion here. But it's amazing how, when you do your contact tracing, how connected we are as human beings, students, faculty, staff, coaches, everyone, administrators. And so that is something that it's very apparent now. And then in the future, I hope that we would feel the same way, that when someone is not in your class, like we use EAB, Bridget, we use Navigate, and a lot of our professors have done a great job with like taking roll, like old school, homeschool, take roll, because if a man or woman's not there, why is he or she not there? There's a chance it might be COVID, which might impact me, or it might just be that they're having a bad day, or that their families are in a bad way. We find out so much about the trials and tribulations, and Doug, you implied this, of what's happening in people's lives through the overarching issue of COVID. But we've learned about students whose dad has stage 3 cancer, people who can't afford textbooks right now, so on and so on. So that deep connectivity, as Dr. King said, we are bound by the mutuality of our humanity. That's something that I really, really dig. Now, on the other side of some other positive things, let me take the 3 pandemics quickly. So what our faculty and staff and our students learn, but starting with the faculty, is that they can. The book by Louis Gerstner is called "Who Says Elephants Can't Dance?" That's the book about Gerstner taking over IBM, left McKinsey and American Express. I am not calling our faculty member elephants at all, but I'm just saying that they can dance. We went from mostly on ground to asynchronous online to all online, asynchronous and some synchronous in like 4 days. So that was the faculty that did that. Congratulations to them. And sometimes faculty members might say, I can't do this. It's too, we need more process. Well, we didn't have the virus didn't give us that opportunity, and they did it. And we did a lot of due diligence after action reports, and it wasn't perfect, but it was good. And now it's even better. Now I would tell you there are modalities, Doug and Bridget, like this virtual rotation, hybrid, high flex, 20 in, 20 out. We're going to keep that going afterwards. We have some things we're doing with community college students that are a little bit further out, that asynchronous virtual rotation might be better than asynchronous online and better than full-time here. So there's some things around mindset, nimble. We did a lot of work this year with Agile Methodology, which you started off in software engineering. I had a good friend of mine, Yuval Naidu from Harvard Business School, my classmate, do some work on this with EAB and also with my leadership team. So we're sort of embracing the concepts of Agile. We did some work with Team of Teams, which is Sam McChrystal's concept of how you have teams that interlike like this. There's shared consciousness. There's empowered autonomy. So people think together, but act, push leadership down. And we really embrace that. And the coronavirus was a reason that we were able to do that. The other pandemic is around social justice. And I would say this, we saw a public lynching. We saw someone murdered in front of the entire world, and the world got really upset about it. And now Black people in particular have an opportunity to communicate with more agency than I've ever had in my 51 years as a Black man in America. We have all had our necks stood upon in some fashion over the years in some way. All my Black friends will tell you a story that is not as haunting as George Floyd, but there's something on the continuum. And now I feel like more people are listening, more white people are listening in a way they never have before, which is pretty powerful. We're getting agency, systemic racism coming up, and understanding how do we address that. And finally, in terms of a democracy, I was talking to one of my students here, and Kristen, her last name escapes me. She's so cool. She's going to take over for you, Bridget. She almost has an impressive voice and presence as you do, but she wants to be a Truman Scholar, and she's into civic education. So here she is working with her peers and faculty members who are doing a great job using virtual rotation to embrace civic education, the old civics class we all had back in the day, because she thinks that we need to be educated citizenry. Madison said that this democracy works if the citizens are informed and educated. It doesn't work if they're not informed and educated. And to have a student at Robert Morris using a platform, using technology in her own voice to do that, that could be the third part of the pandemic. That could be something positive that comes out of it.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate that. So I wanted to ask you about your roles that you've had. So there are two things I'm curious about. I'm really curious about how your military background and your athletic background, how have those informed your leadership? Because you spend time around other college presidents. You understand, how we teach people to lead in higher ed. We have a type, and I feel like often it benefits from other leadership experience, other perspectives like you're bringing to the table. And I'm just wondering how that has changed you as a leader. But I know that you can't tell me that because you are who you came into being a president after doing those things.
Yeah.
So if you can speak to that, I would love to hear it. But I also was just going to ask, you've had really interesting roles, and I'm curious about what one was your hardest? And other than perhaps what you're doing right now, and what one taught you the most?
Sure. So in military leadership parlance, the leadership model, it has to do with the leader, the led, the situation, and communication. The leader, the led, the situation, and communication. And in the military, we also say men and women first, mission always. So it's a servant leader model, and that's the philosophy you step into as a whether you be a sergeant or a general. That's the way we think, right? So coming into higher education, first off, I'm not here to blow it up. Trust the system. The system. I said in a talk a couple of weeks ago that the oldest institutions in our society are the Icelandic Parliament, the papacy, and Oxford and Cambridge. If not, maybe one university in Italy might be before that. So these institutions have been around for a long time. So I'm not going to come in and say I have all the answers from the U.S. Air Force or Joint Special Operations Command or my Air Force or high school football team, which both, by the way, were very successful, and then throw that on top of this place. No, there's a system where process matters, where faculty handbooks matter, where discourse matters. What the military simply says is that that's a different context and a different situation. So you better be able to operate in that. So for military people that come into the academy are the ones that have learned the right lessons from the military, which is understanding your context. When I was serving downrange in places like Bosnia and Afghanistan, you would be amazed the spirit of collegiality and comity, especially dealing with special forces and how it's hearts and minds. It's not, not a lot of finger waving in the Green Beret community. I wasn't one, but I work with those guys. So the context is very important. But what the military does, which is pretty cool, it teaches you how a span of how you can operate within that context. So we've been trained, and I've been educated to say, if I need to, step up and be the sheriff, you can step up and be the sheriff. If I need to hang back and be, and sometimes I do this in my cabinet plus 5 meetings. I say, we're going to do this Quaker style. If you don't have anything to say, don't say anything. But if a spirit hits you, like in this Quaker community, speak. It's fine. Either way. Let's have some silence. And so I think that me personally, having had some different experiences, but also recognizing that you need to move up to being more directive. I'll never use the word authoritarian, but directive, and then slide back to being very much in the collective is something that has served me well. And in some ways you see that on a football team as well. You see when you need to step up and be the vocal leader, when you need to be quiet. But the biggest thing also about athletics is the accountability. Sometimes you're not quite sure if you're winning in the higher education world because there's so many parts of our mission. It's very disparate, very sometimes complex, but not complicated, but complex. In athletics, when we beat Ohio State in the Liberty Bowl 23-11 my senior year, and we were 17-point underdogs, we won, and we knew we won. And I tell Kirk Herbstreit every time I see him from ESPN, we beat you guys. He was a freshman on that team. I was a senior at Air Force. So that's something to kind of take some of the complexity out, which is so different from circumstance to circumstance. The last question you asked, Bridget, I can't remember. I kind of gone on. Was there another part of the question you wanted me to ask?
Just on your of the positions that you've held, which one taught you the most and which one was the hardest?
That's so good. I'm going to choose something unusual. I mean, there's a lot of, okay, I'm going to do two. So one of them was actually my senior year at the Air Force Academy. I was a group commander, so I was in charge of about 1,100 cadets, 21, 22 years old. And I had 10 squadrons, about 120 people reporting to me. And I had a squadron commander who has since then become friends of mine. But when she was commanding her squadron, I remember talking to her and saying, assuming that she liked me, and why don't you do this? And she's like, I'm really not a big fan of yours. Which was a great thing to hear when you're 22 years old, that the people you're leading may or may not like you. And I thought, well, you know what? You don't have to like me. It's not, I don't mean that in a mean way. It's not my job to make you like me. It is not your job to like me. It's our job to take care of the morale, welfare, training, discipline of these, for you, 120 cadets, for me, 1,200, 1,100 cadets. So there's a real dose of humility when you're kind of like, you think you're all that in a bag of chips and someone tells you, I don't really like you that much. So that was a great lesson learned. And then when I worked at Bristol Myers Squibb, my first assignment when I left the military was a big HIV/AIDS initiative in sub-Saharan Africa called Secure the Future. We were giving away $100 million in Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. My wife's South African, by the way. And I remember, and this is the time when ACT UP was threatening needle sticks. The gay community was really upset with the pharma community for selling drugs at a high price in the developing world. And I remember this optic of getting off a plane from America. And I was the only African American in the group. Most everybody else was white. And, all these suits coming from America, sitting down with these NGOs and the governments of these African nations and saying, basically, here we are to save you from yourselves. And that did not go over well. So the whole idea of coming in and presupposing that you have the wisdom, I've got this. Step away, people. It doesn't work, because the actual answers are in the people that are dealing with the issues. At GE, they used to call it a workout. The answers come from the shop floor. The answers come from the village, from the community, from the school. And you need to humble yourself to the complexity and the nuance and all the things that are going on. And then you can bring what Big Pharma, because Big Pharma could make some big drugs, which were amazing. They brought something to the table, but if they forced it in, it didn't work. And it was a very human thing in it. So I was like, I was pretty good in that regard. I'm Black, which gave a point of empathy, which was very interesting. But also I was a pretty good participant, observer, and I ended up giving some good counsel to some more senior people in the company, and we were able to do some good things, that helped save some lives. And so that was a big lesson learned. Be humble.
That is perfect. Thank you so much for giving us that perspective. And it's also just helpful to remember other things that existed and other challenges that existed prior to this moment. We just get so caught up. It all feels like it's right here, and it contributes to the overwhelm. So I really appreciate you kind of reminding us of all the other things that have gone on in this world. We so appreciate you, and we really respect and admire your leadership. Thank you so much, President Howard. Robert Morris is very lucky to have you. Doug, as always, you are a fantastic co-host. Very excited to have you back. And for those of you at home, thank you so much for being here, and we will see you next week.
Stay well.
Thank you.